Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're mapping out a truly fascinating theological debate. For centuries, theologians have been arguing over the exact nature of Christ, right? Well, today, we are zooming in on a modern clash of frameworks. On one side, you've got the Trinitarian H.A.N.D.S argument, which vigorously defends the absolute deity of Christ. On the flip side, we have the Unitarian gospel framework, which argues for a purely messianic, delegated understanding of Jesus. We're going to break down the ancient texts and see exactly how these two perspectives counter one another. It's really like a theological chess match.
So here's our roadmap for today. First up, the H.A.N.D.S argument. Then we'll look at honors and attributes, followed by names, deeds, and seat. After that, we'll dive into some complex texts and finally wrap things up with the Unitarian gospel framework.
All right, part one, the Trinitarian H.A.N.D.S argument. Let's analyze this popular apologetic framework.
So the H.A.N.D.S acronym stands for honors, attributes, names, deeds, and seat. The core argument here is that because Jesus shares these 5 specific divine realities with God the Father, he absolutely must ontologically be God himself. Makes sense on the surface, right? But the Unitarian critique looks at each letter of this acronym and draws a totally different conclusion. See, where the Trinitarian sees rock-solid evidence of inherent, uncreated deity, the Unitarian looks at the historical and biblical context and says, actually, this points to delegated messianic authority. In their view, God is operating through an empowered human agent, rather than that agent actually being the creator.
Moving right along to part 2, honors and divine attributes. Time to unpack the Greek and the texts.
Let's start with honors. Now, a major lexical difference pops up in the Greek text here. Trinitarians correctly point out that Jesus receives worship. However, Unitarian scholars highlight a clear distinction in the original language that separates agency from essence. Take a look at the word proskuneo. It essentially means bowing or showing royal honor, and we see it given to human kings, to angels, and to God throughout the Bible. But then you have latreo, which implies sacred, strictly divine worship. Unitarians point out that this specific word is exclusively reserved for God the Father and is actually never once attributed to Christ in the text.
Next up, the A, attributes. The Trinitarian stance is that Jesus possesses divine attributes, like omniscience, literally knowing absolutely everything. But the Unitarian critique pushes back hard here by pointing directly to the words of Jesus himself. In Mark 13, regarding his return, he explicitly says, "But about that day or hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father." For Unitarians, this explicit limitation of knowledge isn't a mystery, it's a defining proof of genuine humanity.
And then there's this heavy theological concept of aseity. That basically just means having life originally and uncaused entirely within yourself. Unitarians contrast this ultimate divine aseity with Christ's contingent life. They point to texts like John 5:26, which says, "For just as the Father has life in himself, so he has granted the Son also to have life in himself." Notice that key word there, granted. Because his life and authority are received from someone else, they argue it simply cannot be the original uncaused life of the Creator.
Okay, part 3, names, deeds, and seats. Let's dig into some wild statistics and the idea of proxies.
Just take a look at this. There is a massive statistical disparity in the New Testament when it comes to divine titles. The Greek word theos, meaning God, is applied to the Father a staggering 1,291 times. By contrast, it's applied to Jesus in only about 10 highly debated instances. 10! Unitarians argued this immense disparity clearly shows the central operating reality for early Christians was that the Father alone is the one true God. They also assert that titles like Son of God shouldn't automatically be read as ontological deity, but rather within their messianic context as standard, expected titles for God's anointed human king. When looking at deeds, the D in our acronym, the debate centers squarely on incredible works. Trinitarians view Jesus' absolute mastery over nature, his healing of disease, and his involvement in creation as definitive proof of inherent self-derived divine power. But Unitarians see it differently. They argue that Jesus' miracles, much like Moses parting the Red Sea or the apostles healing the sick, stem entirely from delegated authority. Plus, they interpret biblical texts referencing creation through Christ as actually pointing to the new creation of the church and the coming age rather than the original Genesis creation.
Finally, we hit the S, the seat. Trinitarians point out that Jesus is seated on the throne at the right hand of God. Boom, deity, right? Well, Unitarians respond that sitting at the right hand actually denotes a subordinate, proxy role, the ultimate right-hand man. They point to some really powerful human precedent in the Old Testament, specifically 1 Chronicles 29:23, where it says Solomon literally sat on the throne of Yahweh. Just as Solomon was a human proxy ruling for God, they argue Jesus is the ultimate human proxy, exalted to that exact same kind of delegated seat.
Part 4. Interpreting complex gospel verses. Because we really have to ask, how do we handle verses that seem to directly challenge the Unitarian view?
Let's look at the famous I am statements, or ego eimi in Greek. Trinitarians very often view these as Jesus directly claiming the divine name of Yahweh from the burning bush in Exodus. It's a huge pillar of their argument. Unitarian scholars, however, suggest that these are frequently just standard contextual instances of messianic identification. They argue he's simply saying I am he, meaning hey, I am the promised Messiah, rather than explicitly claiming to be the God of Israel.
And this brings us to perhaps the most famous text in this entire debate, Thomas's confession in John 20:28. Upon seeing the resurrected Christ, Thomas exclaims, "My Lord and my God." Trinitarian scholars heavily cite this as absolute, undeniable proof of Christ's deity, arguing Thomas is flat out addressing Jesus as the one true God.
So how do Unitarians handle that? Well, they approach this via what is called the dual affirmation argument. They look back to the context established just a few chapters earlier in John 14, where Jesus teaches Philip that whoever has seen me has seen the Father. Because God was perfectly dwelling in and working through Christ, Unitarians argue that Thomas is looking at the exalted human Jesus and acknowledging his Lord while simultaneously acknowledging the God who is operating entirely within him. Two affirmations happening at once.
Finally, Part 5. The Unitarian Gospel Framework. Because, let's be real, if the Trinitarians have a catchy acronym, you can bet the Unitarians have one too.
To synthesize their massive textual critique, Unitarians offer a direct structural counterargument to H.A.N.D.S. Let's walk through this GOSPL framework step by step to see what they view as the genuine biblical picture of the Messiah.
The G stands for given life. As we touched on earlier, this emphasizes that Christ's life is entirely contingent upon the Father. He doesn't possess uncreated aseity. Rather, his life and his authority were completely granted to him by God. O stands for offered life, and this highlights his true mortality. Unitarians argue that for the crucifixion to have genuine meaning, the one who died had to truly be capable of death. This underscores the very real, literal stakes of a truly human Messiah offering his life on the cross.
Next, the S represents subordinate. So rather than being ontologically equal to the Father in a triune Godhead, this framework views Jesus as perfectly functioning as God's obedient messianic agent. He explicitly says he can do nothing on his own accord, perfectly imaging the Father who sent him.
Now, P is a pretty crucial theological term. Peccable. This argues that Jesus was genuinely capable of being tempted. The logic is, if he were God, he literally could not be tempted by evil. For Christ's perfect obedience to actually be meaningful and relatable to humanity, Unitarians argue he had to feel the genuine, visceral pull of temptation, yet he miraculously and obediently remained completely sinless.
Moving to E, which stands for empowered. This reinforces the idea that his incredible miracles, signs, and his total mastery over nature were achieved entirely through the anointing of God's Spirit, rather than through some inherent self-derived omnipotence. Finally, the L is for limited in knowledge. This honors texts like Mark 13:32, where Jesus openly states he does not know the day or the hour of his return. It roots Jesus in time with us, experiencing life and relying completely on the Father's knowledge rather than possessing divine omniscience himself. Taking a step back, we really have to ask ourselves a larger question. How does understanding these ancient historical and cultural contexts, like the subtle difference between royal honor and divine worship, or the deeply rooted concept of delegated proxy authority, fundamentally change the way we read these foundational texts? Whether you find the Trinitarian H.A.N.D.S argument or the Unitarian gospel framework more compelling, digging into the very language and history of the text forces us to look at these ancient documents with fresh, focused eyes. It's a lot to chew on for sure. So keep asking questions, keep studying the contexts, and keep exploring.